The moment of uncertainty. It was a crisp afternoon, one of those early fall days when the air is just cool enough to make you want to bundle up a little but not too cold for a walk outside. The kind of day that made you want to relax, enjoy the calmness, and soak in the peacefulness of the world around you. Lisa, a young mother, had just stepped out onto the porch with her baby, Mark. The stroller sat there in the soft sunlight, a picture of tranquility. Mark, bundled up in his blanket, was cooing softly, his little hands reaching out in curiosity as Lisa placed the stroller in the shade to shield him from the bright afternoon sun. It was one of those quiet moments, simple and perfect. "I'll only be a minute," Lisa said to herself as she stepped back inside to grab her phone. It had been lying on the kitchen counter, just out of reach, and she figured it would be easier to grab it now than wait for it to ring again. The phone call had already gone to voicemail twice, and she was starting to get annoyed with the interruptions. Mark was fine, just napping, right where she left him, in the stroller outside. She would be back in a flash. As she closed the door behind her, the briefest flicker of a thought crossed her mind. "I'll be quick. There's no need to worry." But as seconds passed into minutes, the thought of checking on him slowly slipped out of her mind. It was just so easy to get distracted. Just one of those moments where you forget about everything else because you're so caught up in the little things. But then the unexpected happened. Lisa returned just moments later, her heart fluttering with the weight of something unspeakable. The door swung open, and as she stepped outside, her eyes immediately darted toward the stroller, expecting to see Mark peacefully sleeping. What she saw instead caused her world to collapse in a single breathless second. The stroller was empty. Lisa froze, her body tensed, her pulse racing in her ears. She felt an icy chill crawl up her spine, gripping her in a way that nothing ever had before. The breeze in the air seemed to grow heavier, like it was pressing in on her, weighing her down. She could hardly breathe, let alone think. Her gaze darted over the porch, scanning for any sign of movement, any clue as to where her baby had gone. Her voice broke into a scream. "Mark." It came out in a strangled, panicked cry, but the world around her remained still. No response, no cry, no sound at all, just silence. The silence was suffocating. Her eyes filled with panic as she ran to the gate, tearing it open and rushing onto the street, her mind unable to comprehend what was happening. She looked up and down the sidewalk, across the neighbors' yards, everywhere. There was no sign of Mark, no sign of anyone. The stroller sat abandoned, its wheels still, as if mocking her horror. The street was quiet, too quiet. Could someone have simply walked up, taken the baby, and disappeared in the brief seconds she had been inside? Was it possible that all this time she had left him alone in the world, vulnerable to whatever could happen next? No, it couldn't be. But there it was, staring back at her, empty, quiet, terrifying. With trembling fingers, she dialed the first number she could think of. Her neighbor, Donna. She needed answers, someone to tell her that she wasn't imagining things, that there was a rational explanation. Her voice was frantic as she asked, "Did you see anyone near my house?" "The stroller. My baby is gone." But all she received in return were blank stares, shaking heads. Nobody had seen anything. Nobody had noticed anything unusual. She could hardly hear their words over the pounding of her pulse in her ears. In desperation, she dialed 911. "My son is missing," she choked out. "He's been taken." The weight of those words crushed her chest, as if 1,000 pounds had been dropped all at once. She was hyperventilating now, barely able to breathe, but she could hear the calm voice on the other end urging her to stay calm, to wait for the police. Minutes stretched like hours. When the officers finally arrived, they were swift, asking questions, too many questions. Where had she been? How long had she been gone? Had she seen anyone near the stroller? She could barely process their questions, her mind still reeling from the overwhelming panic. "Do you have any cameras? We need to check the footage," one officer said, his voice steady and efficient, But Lisa could barely focus on the words. Her entire body felt as if it were in shock. Suddenly, it hit her. The neighbor with the security cameras. "Donna has cameras," Lisa muttered, her voice hoarse with fear. Without waiting for a response, she rushed next door, the officers following closely behind her. The door to Donna's house opened quickly, and within minutes, the police were granted access to the footage. Lisa watched as the screen flickered to life, showing a quiet street, just like the one she had seen moments ago. There she was, stepping inside her house, closing the door behind her. But then, in the corner of the screen, a shadow moved, something large, dark, and quick. Her heart stopped. It was a dog. It was a dog. But how? What was going on? Lisa leaned forward, staring in disbelief at the blurry footage as the dog carefully grabbed the blanket wrapped around Mark and swiftly ran off with him. Her mind reeled, struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. A dog. "This isn't a person," an officer murmured, his expression one of confusion. But who was this dog? It wasn't anyone she knew. And that was just the beginning. The unlikely kidnapper. The world seemed to slow down as Lisa's mind struggled to process what she had just witnessed. The footage on Donna's security camera showed a quiet street, the kind of peaceful scene that should have calmed her nerves. But instead, it made her feel more confused, as if the reality she had known moments ago had splintered into something completely unrecognizable. The dog in the video, a large black Labrador, was moving quickly. It wasn't just walking. It was on a mission. Lisa had seen that kind of focused determination before, in dogs when they were trying to retrieve something, to protect, or even to herd. But this was different. The dog had grabbed the blanket that was wrapped around Mark, as though it had been trained to do so, and then, just like that, it vanished. A breath caught in Lisa's throat. But how could it be a dog? Why would it take my baby? She could barely form the words, let alone understand the situation. A dog. It didn't make sense. Nothing made sense. The officer next to her leaned in closer, studying the screen intently. "It's definitely a dog," he said. His voice was calm, but there was an edge of disbelief to it. "But we need to find out who this dog is, and why it did this." Lisa's heart was racing, and she felt a sense of urgency rush through her veins. How could a dog have taken her baby? How could that even be possible? She had seen the dog in her neighborhood before. She was sure of it. It had been around her house a few times, wandering through the yard or passing by. But it never seemed like it was a threat. It was a neighborhood dog, seemingly harmless, and part of the background noise of daily life. But that image of the dog grabbing her baby, of the dog running off with Mark so quickly and efficiently, was burned into her mind. It wasn't just the speed of the movement, or the way the dog seemed to know exactly what to do, but the way it disappeared into the distance, as if the world didn't matter except for what it was carrying. "Mark." She turned to the officer, her voice shaking. "Do you think it's a stray? A dog that just wandered off with my baby?" The officer nodded slowly, his brow furrowed. "It's hard to say. We'll need to track down the dog, see if anyone knows it, but it's important that we act quickly. If it's a stray, it could be harder to find. If it's someone's pet, it's possible they have more information." Lisa felt a deep pang of despair. She was grasping at straws. She wanted to scream, to demand answers. But all she had were more questions, and the urgency to find Mark was all-consuming. "Let's get to work," another officer said, his tone authoritative but filled with compassion. "We'll check the area, ask around, see if anyone's seen the dog, or if anyone knows who it belongs to." Lisa, however, couldn't just stand by. She had to do something. Her mind raced back to every time she had seen that black Labrador in the neighborhood. She tried to remember its owner, if there even was one. Could it have been a dog from one of the nearby houses? It wasn't much to go on, but it was all she had. "I've seen this dog before," Lisa said, her voice almost a whisper. "It's always around here, walking up and down the street. But I don't know who owns it." She paused, her mind whirling. "I think I've seen it near the Parkers' house." The officer glanced at her, catching her gaze. "The Parkers' house. We'll check there next." The weight of those few words hit Lisa hard. The Parkers were one of the few families she knew in the neighborhood. But could it be their dog? She hadn't thought about it until now. All the time she had seen the black Labrador, walking alone or trotting along with other dogs, never had it crossed her mind that it might be a threat. She had always thought of it as just another part of the neighborhood. But now it felt like the pieces were falling into place, one after another, in the most inexplicable and terrifying way. Minutes felt like hours as the officers searched the street, knocking on doors and speaking to neighbors. Lisa tried to keep her focus, but her mind kept racing back to the footage, the blurry image of the dog carrying her baby away. She could still hear the faint sound of paws on the pavement, the rustling of the blanket, the soft breeze. Everything seemed to be in slow motion. Then an officer approached her, holding his phone with a look of urgency in his eyes. "We've got something," he said. "The Parkers are familiar with the dog. They said it belongs to someone in the neighborhood. We'll need to visit them now." Lisa's stomach twisted in knots. Was this dog really the one who had taken Mark? Had it been a misunderstanding, an accident, or something more? She couldn't fathom it. But she couldn't stop herself from following the officer as they drove to the Parkers' house, her thoughts spinning uncontrollably. The worst was still ahead. If the dog really had taken her baby, it meant there was so much more to uncover. And if there was something deeper going on, something that no one had even noticed before, Lisa needed to find out. But nothing could prepare her for what was coming next, the unexpected reunion. As the police cars sped through the neighborhood, Lisa's thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. The images of the black Labrador racing off with her baby were playing in her mind like a movie she couldn't turn off. The soft, whimpering cries of her baby, was she imagining them? Was Mark even okay? Lisa's hands clenched together, the tightness in her chest only growing with each second that passed. She needed answers, and she needed them now. The officers were talking amongst themselves as they approached the Parkers' house. It was a well-kept two-story home with neatly trimmed hedges and a wide, welcoming porch. The white picket fence gave the impression of a perfect family, the kind of neighbors you could always count on for a wave or a friendly hello. Lisa had never imagined that anything out of the ordinary could be linked to this place, let alone the dog that had taken her son. As the car came to a stop in front of the house, Lisa felt her pulse quicken. This is it. This is where the answers lie. The officers stepped out of the car, and Lisa followed them closely, her heart hammering in her chest. The door to the Parkers' house opened before the officers could even knock. Mrs. Parker, an older woman with kind eyes and a welcoming smile, stood in the doorway, her face filled with concern when she saw the police. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice soft with worry. Lisa could see that Mrs. Parker was genuinely puzzled, unaware of the chaos unfolding around her. "We're investigating a situation involving a dog," one of the officers began, his tone polite but firm. "A black Labrador. We believe it might have been involved in an incident this afternoon." He paused, watching her closely. "Do you recognize this dog?" Mrs. Parker's eyes widened. "Jess," she whispered. "You mean Jessie?" Lisa's heart skipped a beat. Jessie. She remembered now. The Parkers had a black Labrador named Jessie. But why would their dog take her baby? The confusion deepened, and Lisa's mind raced as she tried to connect the dots. "Jess." Lisa's voice broke through the officer's conversation, her eyes searching Mrs. Parker's face. "That's the dog that took my baby." Her breath caught in her throat, and the urgency of the situation made her almost feel dizzy. Mrs. Parker nodded slowly, her expression turning serious. "Yes, that's Jessie. But I don't understand. He's never done anything like this before. We've had him for years. He's always been, well, loyal." She hesitated, and Lisa could see the guilt and confusion in her eyes. "I don't know why he would do this." The officers exchanged glances, sensing the tension in the air. Is there any way we can talk to him? See if we can understand what happened. Before Mrs. Parker could respond, her eyes turned toward the back door. He's out back. I can show you, but I don't think this is something that can be explained by just asking. Jess has always been a bit different lately. He's been acting strange. Lisa, her mind reeling, followed closely behind the officers as they walked through the house and out into the backyard. The Parkers' yard was beautiful, with flowers blooming in every corner, a hammock hanging between two tall oak trees, and a small fenced-in area for their dog. Jesse was in the far corner of the yard, lying down with his head resting on his paws. When he saw the group approaching, he didn't get up. Instead, he looked at them with his deep, dark eyes, calm, yet strangely distant. The officers approached cautiously, their eyes scanning the dog's posture. Lisa couldn't take her eyes off of him. This was the dog that had taken her son. This was the creature that had startled her to the very core. She had to know why. But at that moment, everything felt overwhelming. Why had he taken Mark? Was this some kind of mistake? Jess, Mrs. Parker called softly. The dog's ears perked up at the sound of her voice, and he raised his head, but he didn't move. There was a quiet, heavy silence in the air. Then, to Lisa's surprise, the dog stood up and slowly trotted over to them. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't barking or growling. He was simply there. Lisa's heart fluttered with confusion as she stepped closer, trying to understand this strange connection. It was as if Jesse knew he wasn't in trouble, as if he knew he had done something that needed to be explained. The officers watched carefully, but there was no sign of aggression. Jesse was calm, even gentle in his movements. Then, as if on cue, a vibration from her phone broke the silence. Lisa's fingers trembled as she checked the screen. The number on the caller ID was unfamiliar, but the message that appeared made her stomach drop. "You need to see this. Come now." The message was from her ex-husband, Mark's father. Lisa's first instinct was panic, but she knew she had to act fast. Without saying a word to the officers or Mrs. Parker, she turned and rushed to her car, her heart racing with dread. What now? What could be worse than this? The drive to her ex-husband's house felt like it took forever, each second stretching out in an agonizing blur. The officers followed closely behind, their presence both comforting and overwhelming. What was waiting for her there? What could be so urgent? All she wanted was her baby back, safe and sound. When Lisa finally arrived, she was practically running to the door. Her ex-husband opened it before she could even knock, his face pale, eyes red-rimmed from tears. But it was what she saw next that stopped her cold. Mark was asleep, peacefully, in a chair in the living room. His tiny hands curled into fists, his face soft with sleep, and lying beside him, curled up in content, was Jesse. Lisa stood frozen in the doorway, unable to breathe. The scene before her was impossibly surreal. Jesse was simply lying next to Mark, his body relaxed, his eyes closed in a peaceful, almost loving way. There was no malice in the dog's gaze, just loyalty. "Mark," Lisa whispered, her voice breaking as she rushed to her baby. She scooped him into her arms, holding him tightly against her chest, feeling the warmth of his body. "I'm so sorry," her ex-husband said quietly, his voice filled with regret. "I never meant for this to happen." But Jess, he knew. He knew how much I missed him, how much I wanted to bring him back to me. She must have understood it in her own way. He gestured toward the dog, who was still watching them from the floor, his tail wagging slowly. Lisa could barely process the words. Her mind was a mess of confusion, anger, and strangely enough, understanding. Jess hadn't meant harm. Jess had acted out of a deep and unspoken need. A need to comfort his owner, to bring him peace. The dog had taken Mark, not out of malice, but out of loyalty to the man who had missed him so deeply. The situation was complicated, strange, and heartbreaking. As Lisa stood there, holding her baby close, She felt the storm of emotions begin to settle. She was exhausted, physically and emotionally. But one thing was clear. Sometimes the answers we seek come from the most unexpected places. And sometimes healing comes from those we least expect to help us. The power of unseen bonds. The room was still, the only sound coming from the gentle rustle of the leaves outside and the soft, steady breathing of Mark as he nestled in his mother's arms. The weight of the situation was starting to settle into Lisa's bones, a mixture of relief, confusion, and an unspoken understanding that she couldn't fully articulate. As she held her baby, the chaos of the past hours began to fade, leaving only the quiet serenity of the moment. Jesse, the dog who had unknowingly turned her world upside down, still lay on the floor at her feet, his eyes soft and unassuming. His tail wagged slowly, as though he was content in the peace that had returned. Lisa's heart clenched. She had been so quick to judge, so quick to react. But now, with Mark safely in her arms, the anger and fear that had once clouded her vision started to dissolve. As she rocked him gently in her arms, the room seemed to quiet once again. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was filled with a sense of peace, of possibility. It wasn't just the end of a frightening experience. It was the beginning of something new, something that would require patience, understanding, and the willingness to let go of the past. Lisa stood up slowly, cradling Mark against her chest as she turned to look at Max. "Let's start fresh," she said softly, her voice steady but warm. "Together, for him." Max nodded, tears filling his eyes once again, but this time they weren't from sorrow. They were tears of gratitude. Jesse stood up beside him, looking up at Lisa with those same understanding eyes. In that moment, she realized that healing wasn't always about fixing what was broken. Sometimes it was about understanding, forgiving, and moving forward, together. And with that, Lisa stepped out into the world again, this time not with fear in her heart, but with hope, love, and the knowledge that sometimes, even the most unexpected things, like a dog, can teach us the true meaning of family. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.